The year is 1935. The driving test has just been made mandatory across the UK. Back then, the car was still a new commodity in British households. Just 1 in every 4 people owned one because the cost of buying a new car was so high. Learner drivers today complain that the modern driving test is too difficult, but they're taking the test in modern cars with modern technology. Imagine taking it in 1935. All of this leads us to a question. What must it have been like to drive a car 75 years ago?
Well, in short, it was difficult. Not only were there no test centres for drivers to practice in, the cars themselves were a world apart from what we know today. There was no sat-nav, no radio, not even any light-up indicators. Even the control layout was different. You might grab what you think is the handbrake only to discover it's the gear stick. To young drivers, it must have been absolutely terrifying. In fact, when the driving test first began, it had only a 63% pass rate. When war broke out in Europe in September of 1939, the driving test was suspended for the duration. When it re-established itself in 1947, people who'd been driving vehicles just like this during the war were able to get their licences for free from the government.
I met up with Lee, who's been a fan of classic cars since he was a boy. He offered to give me a drive in his 1936 Austin 6, the same car that many people would have used to pass their driving tests. I asked him if he thought the driving test in 1935 was more difficult than the modern version.
Well, obviously the road conditions were not like they are today. It wasn't so busy, but the driving of the car is a lot more engaging, I think. You have to think more about what you're doing and give more time to what you're doing. I think that they've had to change the driving test to suit the conditions. I'm sure the driving test wasn't as hard when I passed my test in about 1960 as it is now. But then, as I said before, the road conditions were different. There were far less cars, lorries, buses on the road then.
Fortunately, today there are a lot more driver aids to help learners pass the driving test. But there are still those who say that classic cars made for better drivers. I'm here at the Road Transport Museum in Lincoln, a place stocked to the rafters with motoring memorabilia from a bygone era.
Supporters of the classic car culture say that because cars of the 1930s and 40s were so difficult to drive, they made for better drivers. One of these supporters is Richard Weller, who's been driving classic cars for the past 2 decades.
I think the test today is a lot harder than it used to be, although cars themselves are a lot more difficult to drive. We've got, in those days, you had no ABS, power steering. You had to think about it. You had to actually drive them, not just sit there and aim them as you can do with a lot of modern cars. Personally, I feel a little bit vulnerable in an older car, so you have to drive more defensively, I think is probably the way of putting it. You're not as safe, so you can't take the risks that you can if some drivers do in modern cars.
So however hard the modern driving test might be, it's a far cry from the strict series of tests and examinations drivers in 1935 had to go through. And the cars themselves have changed too. They've become more economical, easier to drive and easier to buy. There's now an estimated 750 million cars on the planet, so making sure people drive safely is more important than ever. There's even plans to make the modern driving test more realistic to the driving experience. But that's still a far cry from what people had to experience 75 years ago.
Over time, the driving test has changed to suit the technology of the cars. There's now plans to introduce a free driving element to the test, making it harder for learners to anticipate what instructors will ask them.
So the next time you think the modern driving test is too difficult or unfair, just remember what we've seen today. It could have been a lot worse.